All right, so looking at our reference photo, let me actually make this a teensy bit smaller so you guys can actually see what we're doing here. We're gonna figure out kind of how these things work in relationship to each other. So I tend to work with the things that are in the foreground. So if you remember, we've got foreground, midground, background, right? So the object that is most in the foreground is actually our cube. So that's what I'm going to draw first, and then basically I'm going to kind of work my way backwards. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because if I don't work if I try to work like from the backwards front, what's going to happen is I'm going to have overlapping forms, and that we're not going to get that sense of depth because things are going to be a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just super lightly sketch in with my charcoal pencil, even though I know, like I noticed that over here, you know, we've got a really highlighted side to the cube. And I'm going to use citing. So I know, like in relationship, my cube here is over kind of 3/4 of the way over on where my paper is going to be, right? So I'm going to kind of just sketch this out. And I'm doing it pretty lightly. Now remember, with the charcoal, it blends really, really well, which means if you're putting a lot on, you've got a lot of value already added to it. And so, you know, it is an awesome thing, but it is also something you have to kind of be aware of so it doesn't do too much. And particularly on the side that I know is going to be mostly highlighted, I'm going to actually try and go as light as I can here, so barely putting anything, because really that most of that area is going to be white, and I don't want the white charcoal and the black charcoal to combine too much, because then it gets this muddy, weird gray color, and it doesn't look quite how I want it to look for this kind of drawing. Now sometimes you want that, and especially if you're working on maybe a gray toned paper or something where it blends in better, it might work well. But for this colored paper, which is a little bit more of kind of a beige, it does not work so well. So looking kind of backwards into space, I noticed that both the sphere and the cylinder are actually about the same location in kind of the background space. So I'm just going to pick one and work with it. And again, I'm just kind of using citing here so I can kind of see that my cylinder is overlapping a little bit with the cube just at the very back corner of the cube, the back right corner. So I'm going to start with kind of my line there. I'm just using citing to kind of figure out size. And again, right now I'm just plugging in the contours. So I'm not doing any shading at all. I just want to kind of get a sense of where everything is going to go. And then I need to pay attention to how big the cylinder is going to be. And I noticed that it's about halfway down on the cube. I'm going to remember to kind of curve the bottom, right? Because remember, cylinders need to be curved. And I am actually noticing that I made mine a little bit too narrow, so I'm actually going to extend that. And charcoal, you guys, is pretty forgiving, right? Because we can end up kind of smushing most of this out when we shade, and it will disappear. Okay. So I've got my cylinder kind of plugged in there. I might actually make the curve a little bit more defined. So don't be afraid, even though you know, we're working with a different medium than pencil, you can still kind of erase if you need to. Remember, use your kneaded eraser. Or if you know it's going to end up getting blended in, like I know this is all going to be in shadow anyway, so it doesn't matter if I've got a weird random line. I'm going to go ahead and do the sphere next. So same thing. I'm using kind of relationships here, and that's really what, you know, citing is as far as proportion, to kind of figure out where everything's going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the citing to kind of figure out where it intersects with and overlaps with my cube. And I'm going to notice that as far as placement, it's about the same places where my cylinder is. So I can even kind of bring this over. So I know that the bottom of the sphere shouldn't kind of go past that point right there. So I'm going to go ahead and use that to help with my placement there. And again, working with really just light contour lines at this point. And then lastly, I notice that my cone is offset. So it's a little bit more forward in space. So I would say it's more mid-ground if we're kind of assuming that our cube is kind of a little bit in the foreground. So same thing, I'm going to kind of use citing to figure out the spacing between I noticed that the narrowest point is about like right there, and that's going to help me figure out how tall to make this. So look in here, and it looks like it's about that high. So these are all skills that we are practicing. So even though for this one your success criteria is all about the implied line and the shading, you're still practicing your observational drawing skills. You're still practicing sighting. And you're going to get better and better at it. And remember, cones have a bit of a curve to them too. Okay. And there we go. So we have our contours. The rest of it is the shading, right? So we tend to shade, we're going to shade actually from dark to light, which I know is a little bit different from what we usually do with the graphite pencils. So we need to kind of recognize where we're going to leave spaces kind of blank for our white charcoal. So I'm going to work over from my cone. Remember, cones, you're radiating out from the point up at the top. So I can kind of see that it's darkest over on the left-hand side. And right now, I'm just putting a really light layer of charcoal on. I'm not really digging in, right? So let me kind of show you what I mean by digging in. So I'm not going as hard as I possibly can and going as dark as I can. So just like the graphite pencils, you want to build up the value a little bit. Remember that you can kind of smush and blend it in if you want. You can use your finger if you really want to get messy, or you can wrap your finger in a paper towel and just kind of blend it out. Now this paper has a lot more texture than your sketchbook paper, so it's going to hold the charcoal actually a lot better. So there shouldn't be as much. It might be a little bit harder to smudge because, you know, it's kind of gripping it. And I'm just going to add my layers here. And then where the midtone is here, I'm actually going to let the paper just show through. So I'm not going to, you know, I'm just going to leave it blank. I'm not actually going to add any charcoal there. I'm going to go ahead and do my shadow here. And since this shadow is actually pretty blurry, it just means I get to smudge a little bit more, which is kind of cool. A little bit easier to do with charcoal than it is with your graphite pencils. Okay. Let me do some additional smudging here. And then when I think I'm mostly done with that, I'm going to go ahead and add my highlight. So the white charcoal works very similar to the dark charcoal. So a little bit goes a long way. I'm mostly going to just put it where I think it's most highlighted, and then I'm going to blend. Now when I blend, I don't want to use the same bit that I've already blended with the regular charcoal, because obviously it's going to mix, right? This is going to get into that. So either have a separate little, you know, maybe tear off a separate piece from your towel, and then you can use that to blend. And do you see how that white kind of really pops? I don't know, I think it's really a cool effect. And especially when we're working with objects that are generally pretty light in value, it really, you know, helps make it stand out. And it looks three-dimensional, right? Now I am left with this kind of contour line over on that left-hand side that should be highlighted. So I am going to do a little bit of overlap. So even though it's going to mix a teensy bit, I think I like that better than just leaving the contour line there. So same process here. We're going to work from dark to light. So remember, your sphere is actually probably your hardest object to shade. You're working with the cross contours with it, so your shading should be following the curves. And pay attention to the lighting there, right? Now for this one, it doesn't have a very dark core shadow, probably because it's a very white sphere and it's very highlighted reference photo. But where you're really seeing the darkness of the shadow is down below with the cast shadow. And again, I want to leave it where there's a midtone value. I want to leave it with the paper. I don't want to go over it with charcoal. Let the paper do the work for you. And then smudge that out before you move to the white. And remember, a little bit goes a long way. And if you end up smudging a little bit over, since you know your finger is not super precise, you can always use your kneaded eraser if you need to. I'm going in with my highlighted area now. There's a teeny bit of reflected light going on there, so I'm going to actually include that as well as right there. So I'm just kind of paying attention. But notice right now it's not very well blended, right? So you definitely don't skip that step of blending. So we want it to really kind of seamlessly transition, just like we do with the graphite. So moving on to the cube, which actually my cube's a little off, so I'm going to actually adjust for that a teeny bit. And remember, cubes are a little bit easier because you're not having to do a full kind of gradient on each side. Usually there's fairly uniform color. Now you'll notice that I did mine in 2 different directions, which as long as they blend, that's okay. But if you're not doing a whole lot of blending, that is going to be a problem because it's going to look messy. Okay, so make sure that you are fully blending, even if it's just a single value that's happening here. Now, the top of this is almost just a midtone, so I'm just putting a little bit of shading, and what I'm doing is I'm shading out for my contour lines, just because I want them to sort of disappear and not be obvious as lines. I want them to seem like they're actually part of the shading, but I also want to leave some of the paper there. And then I'm going to put my highlight in. And again, just like I did with the cone, I'm overlapping the contour lines because I don't want the dark line to be visible necessarily. Let me see, I got my angle a little bit wrong on my cube when I adjusted it. And then lastly, the cylinder. I'm almost in the home stretch there. Now I am going to go back and add cast shadow. And then do you guys notice how in the reference photo, it's a little bit darker over on the right-hand side in the background and a little bit more highlighted over on the right-hand side? We're going to put a little bit of that in because that's going to help create that implied line a little bit more in the spots where we didn't really get it with shading within the spheres and within the cubes and cylinders. And I'm layering more than just adding, lots of pressure in spots. So I'm just going back and kind of adding value rather than digging in with my charcoal. So. darkest shadows in. Now I'm noticing at the bottom of each of my forms, there's a little bit more kind of shadow area there between the form and its cast shadow. So I'm just making sure I include that. So remember, it's a lot about observation, right? So almost done here. My last bit is to address the background. So since we've got a much darker value here, now I could draw a frame around it. I don't think that I necessarily need to do that. But what I'm going to do is, particularly over here on the right hand side, I'm going to just quickly add in a really light, quick bit of shadow. And I'm mostly going to end up blending this in. And my purpose for doing this is not only to be true to the reference photo, but remember to always kind of get that implied line really, really happening there. I might actually, if you ended up picking one of the charcoal pencils up, just be aware that they're a little bit harder charcoal, so they don't blend quite as well. You might be better off grabbing also one of the little actual chunks of charcoal. So I'm noticing that mine's really, really hard, so it's making it hard to blend without adding too much value. So I'm just going to kind of go back and add some additional layering here. And that's it. So when you guys do your own, my expectation is that you're using the whole piece of paper. So we're not doing little mini drawings. I probably could have even gone bigger than what I did here. You don't want to obviously, go over the edge, but you want to use your space. So remember, you're going to get your contours in, use sighting to figure out the relationships with each other, figure out which ones are in the foreground, midground, background. Start with the ones that are up front first. Okay, and then you are working from the darkest value to the highlighted lightest value. And you're using 2 different paper towels to do your smudging so that you don't mix them too much.